We're going to get started. So I would suggest that folks come, as far down as possible to, make this as... Okay. So I would suggest that folks at the back just come further down so that we're, a compact group. It'll make it much more interesting and fun, right, Paul? Welcome, everybody. To this keynote presentation, The Respect Effect, using science to help us connect and engage. And welcome to everyone who's joined via WebEx here in the US and also overseas, I believe. So thanks for your time today. This is one of several company-sponsored events during June in celebration of LGBT Pride Month, and this is celebrated around the world. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Richard Cook. My day job is Regulatory Affairs Section Head for the U.S. Personal Healthcare business. And in addition to my day job, I also serve on the Gable North America leadership team, our affinity group for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender employees and their allies. And I mention this for two reasons. First, Gable is one of the sponsors of Paul Mashenko's visit to P&G today. And second, it was as a result of representing P&G at Gable at last year's Out and Equal conference that we first met Paul, and he delivered an outstanding presentation on respect at the Out and Equal conference. Paul's words apply to everyone, not just LGBT people. And so we at Gable, along with the HR Diversity and Inclusion Center of Excellence, and the NBC R&D Site Culture team are delighted to sponsor Paul's talk today for all employees. As I said, Paul's presentation at Out and Equal is outstanding. He was able to help me understand the science of respect and disrespect and its connection to business results, both positive and negative. As we left the workshop, Whit and I, Laura Whit from CBD was also there, Whit and I emphatically agreed we needed to bring Paul into P&G so that more people could hear his words and how his work applies to our careers and relationships at P&G. So in this keynote presentation, Paul will reveal the transformational power of respect in the workplace and will explain the hard science proving why respect is the most powerful employee motivator, how to build a corporate culture based on respect, the 12 rules of respect, a simple but powerful way to communicate respectfully in any situation, and the strategy, resources, and requirements and tools for sustaining a respectful workplace culture. We very much hope you enjoy this presentation. Please welcome Mr. Paul Mashenko, CEO of Legacy Business Cultures.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. First of all, good afternoon. You can do a little bit better than that. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Awesome. So we have a relatively short agenda today. I'm told we have to be wrapped up by 7 o'clock this evening, so I'm going to try to move pretty quickly. First of all, thanks, Richard, for that nice introduction. And it was actually a pleasure for me and an honor to be presenting at the Out and Equal conference in San Francisco last year, and just had the absolute most wonderful conversation with Richard and Laura. And so what we've done is we've taken that presentation and we've actually expanded it. We're going to give you guys a lot more what I would call the tools that we can actually use to contribute to this essence or this idea of a respectful workplace. But we're going to go about defining that through some very, what I would call, non-traditional ways that I hope you'll find interesting as I do. Does anybody recognize this backdrop, what movie this was from? What was this? Young. So I do have an orientation towards nostalgia a little bit. You'll see a lot of things from the past. And our goals today are relatively simple. The first and foremost is to have a little bit of fun. You okay with this? All right. I remember when I was younger, my father said, Bob Mashenko, he said, Paul, we're not here for a long time. We're here for a good time. How many of you think that's good advice for a father to give his son? Yeah. Now, my mom didn't think his timing was very good because he told me that on my way out the door to my freshman year at Ohio State. So, I suppose, which could explain why I was there for 5 years instead of 4 on the undergraduate side. But anyways, it really does impact the ability that we have to actually take in and store information. So I'm going to do my best to kind of keep things on the light side a little bit today, just to kind of keep the pathways for learning open. We are going to explore this whole notion of what respect is. And some of you may already be thinking, this is a really basic subject. How could we spend 2 hours talking about respect? Well, believe it or not, we in some organizations will spend a day and a half talking about this, because it is such a, I think what you'll find an appreciation for today is just how nuanced of a subject it is. And once you start getting below the first layer of the onion, how absolutely rich of a subject it is, but how much more committed we become to becoming practitioners of respect, both in work and our personal lives. So we're going to talk a lot about what it is, how it affects employee engagement, but then also how, probably most importantly, to all of our shareholders and other stakeholders of the business, how it contributes to world-class business results. I will then spend the last part of the presentation actually giving you a toolkit. We call it the 12 Rules of Respect. And it's going to be a very easy to follow set of guidelines that I think each of you will find there are probably 2 or 3 that apply to you the most. They would be what we call low-hanging fruit, areas where you can immediately improve the quality of your interactions and relationships with other people. And then, time provided, and if anybody has any, I'll certainly stick around for a few questions and answers afterwards, okay? Now, how many of you in here are into social media, like Twitter and Facebook? I will absolutely not be offended if I see people doing this, because I'm assuming you're not checking your email. You'll be tweeting about how absolutely incredibly interesting this content is today, right? So let's go ahead and by the way, my style is very interactive. I will ask a lot of questions, and I will wait patiently until I get responses. I'm really patient. So let's start with getting some ideas from each of you. Why do you think this topic is so important, either to us as individuals or as an organization? What do we get from respect? Anybody? Trust. It builds trust. What else? Engagement. Yes, energy and engagement. It actually kind of makes, and when we talk about engagement, what we're really talking about is winning people's hearts, actually getting their emotional connectedness to the broader support and success of the organization, right? What else? Agility. Is it safe to say that there's a lot of change going on within the Procter & Gamble organization right now? And if we don't, and if we're not keeping track of it, how does change typically affect people? Right? And what we know that is that as a culture, as a group, if we actually build strong connections between us, we actually become much more resilient and much more adaptable. What else? This is great so far. Other reasons why respect is so important.
I think on a cultural level, it'll be interesting to understand what's really not the things you can do as actions or tasks, but more like what respect is, because some different cultures can see something disrespectful where, in other places might not be, and vice versa.
And your name is, remind me again?
Marta.
So Marta, you're absolutely right. And one of the things that I will tell you is that the reason that respect, and is anybody in here involved with P&G's diversity and inclusion initiatives at all? A lot of people. So one of the things we find is that respect is a great next step for D&I curriculum and programs, because it feels the same to every person on this planet. Everybody, no matter what your age, your gender, your ethnic background, your hair color, your skin color, respect feels the same to us. But how we create that feeling differs from culture to culture. And we can't really know how to create that feeling with other people unless we get to know them at an individual level, right? So you're absolutely right. Any others? Any other thoughts on the top of your head right now about why this is so important? It can lead to disruptive thinking in a good way, right? Innovation and creativity. We're going to talk very specifically about that. Somebody else over here had something.
It may also be a feeling that people take for granted. Sometimes
Yeah.
is appropriate.
You know when it's there, but you absolutely know when it's not there, right? You're right. So let's kind of go to the 10,000 foot level, and I'll tie the threads back to some of the things that you've said. But whenever you write a book on a subject, it's always good to make a strong business case on the front end. And so after working with a lot of our clients, I tried to summarize from their perspective why this was so important. And the first is that there's this notion that, to most people, that respect and dignity are basic human rights. Because you're a person and I'm a person, we have the right to be treated with respect and dignity. How many of you believe that fundamentally? Sure. Now, here's a question. How many of you know people who would, if they were here, they would raise their hand, but they don't treat people with a lot of respect? Yep. So this is the politically correct response, but it's not always enough to change behaviors. So we have to cast a wider net than that. Another reason is it absolutely improves perceptions of inclusiveness, engagement, and camaraderie. In fact, what we'll find today is that respect actually creates the perfect bridge to inclusive workplaces. Number three, it minimizes what we'll simply call respect accidents. When people kind of go so far outside the bounds of what is respectful that there are implications and consequences for those behaviors. And I'll simply give you a dollar figure. In 2014, just in the US, when you factored in all the legal costs, all the lost productivity, attorney's fees, disrespect, broadly speaking, cost this economy $2 billion. How many of you think we could find much better ways to spend $2 billion rather than cleaning up respect accidents? So that's a reason. Another reason is that it promotes a very high level of customer satisfaction. Is that important to P&G? Critically important, isn't it? So we'll talk about that connection a little bit more. The reason, though, that I'm going to spend the most time talking about today, and I think what Richard and Laura found so intriguing, is this last one. And we'll kind of tie into my nostalgia a little bit more. So what TV series was this from? Lost in Space. And like, wow. I was like the age of this young character on the far right, young Will Robinson, when this was actually on TV. Those of you from the younger generation, this is still on. I think it's called TV Time on TV Land. Thank you. It's TV Land. You can still watch these episodes. But the series, and I'll summarize it very quickly, it's about this family, the Robinson family, who's about to go off to this other human settlement and start colonizing it, but their ship goes awry because they were sabotaged by the evil Dr. Smith in the middle. And the character that I want to focus on the most, because then the whole rest of the series is about their different meanderings through different planets and with different alien tribes and stuff like that. But the character on the far left, he went by a very simple name. What was his name? Just Robot. We just called him Robot, right? And Robot, and your name is Leroy. Leroy, did you watch Lost in Space? Oh, yeah. So Leroy, Robot, he had a very particular role. Throughout the entire series, he had one very basic role. What was that for the most part?
He was Will's confidant.
And he was there to protect everybody, right? And when there was danger afoot, what would he do? I'm going to stand up. Come on, what did he do, Leroy? What did he do? Warning, danger, Will Robinson. Exactly. Give Leroy a round of applause. That took a lot of courage. And if the aliens were particularly dangerous, he could even shoot lightning bolts out of his little claw hands, right? But the reason I use this as an analogy is because you and I have a biological equivalent of Robot buried deep in the middle of our brain. Sometimes you've heard it referred to as the fight or flight system. And this is it's one of the oldest elements of the human brain. It goes back to the earliest phases of our evolution. It is actually located right on the brain stem for the most part. Anybody want to guess why it's located right on the brain stem? For quickness, because it actually can cause our limbs to respond the most quickly. And the reason, and this is a good circuit, by the way, this fight or flight circuit is really good because it has kept us safe over hundreds of thousands of years as a species, and it allowed us to become the most adaptable species on the planet. Today, however, the dangers that the fight or flight circuit was typically there to protect us from, namely saber-toothed tigers and marauding tribes with spears, those aren't there anymore. But that same circuitry is there. Now what does danger look like in most of our worlds? Someone from accounting or sales and marketing that comes up snarling, or somebody tapping their foot waiting for a report, right? So it should be no surprise to you or I that the single most recognizable shape to your brain than my brain is another human face, because that is the most likely source of danger to us. Now, when we feel threatened, and by the way, threatened can mean physical, but it can be emotional, it can mean reputational, it can mean anything. When we feel threatened, it activates the fight or flight circuit, but the important part to recognize is something immediately stops working. And anybody in here who's a little bit familiar with brain science knows that there's a part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your brain that Procter & Gamble actually hired for the most part to come and work. It's the part of your brain that does complex problem solving, deciding between 10 priorities, what do we need to start first to get everything else done? And if I get stuck on this project and I don't have the resources, who can I go and network with? So all those complex thinking processes that really only we as human beings, as far as we know, have the ability to do, those go offline because my brain instead is preoccupied with what? Safety, staying safe. So when we actually become really good at practicing this thing called respect, it literally primes our brains. It kind of puts our radar, our threat radar, on low alert. And we can go back to doing our job. But there's something actually unique that happens when we practice what we call extroverted respect. When you and I go out of our way to make somebody else feel valued, to feel important, to feel capable and competent. It actually releases a complex cocktail of neurohormones and neurotransmitters that we'll talk about a little bit later that actually boost our productivity and make us even more capable than we typically are. So what we'll talk about is, what does that really look like and how do we get there? And what does that mean for the business if we're successful? So let's now move to a definition. Since we're going to be talking about this quite a bit, might as well define what respect is, at least as far as our conversation today is concerned. So I'm going to put two words up here on the screen, and I want you to think about them, and I want you to think about whether they mean the same thing or whether they're different. And those two words are respect and tolerance. Are they the same or are they different? Well, that didn't take long. So how are they different?
Spelled different.
They're spelled differently. Always one in every audience. They are spelled differently. How else are they different?
Tolerance is a low bar. I'll allow you to do this, and respect is I value that you.
Okay, so tolerance, if we were to create a hierarchy, we would say tolerance is lower than respect. Okay, what else? I like that.
External and respect isn't like both external and internal. Like it's not only what people see, but actually what you believe.
Okay, all right, sure. So it's more inclusive in what we how it affects our behavior around others. What else?
Respect has more empathy in it.
Okay, respect by definition should have more empathy in it. Okay, let me ask you a question. So I want you to do a little thought experiment with me. Imagine that when we're done today at 7 o'clock, some of your colleagues are still around because that's the culture. We work until it's done. And they're saying, hey, how was that presentation on respect that you went to today? And your face lights up. You're saying, first of all, the speaker, he rocked it. Secondly, we did some cool exercises, and I met some of my other coworkers, and I got to know them in a way that I really wasn't expecting. That was so incredible. You know, I really felt tolerated today. And they would look at you like, what? Like, right? And so if you had to give being tolerated, if you thought of all the other words you could use to describe how you felt around your peers, what letter grade would you give being tolerated? Maybe a D, maybe a C, C minus, but it's not that it's bad. In fact, how many of you have had days when you would have gladly accepted just being tolerated because you got even less than that? That happens on occasion, right? But it's not that tolerance is a bad thing. In fact, there's a website, tolerance.org, but it's simply a very low standard to set for ourselves, as was suggested. And so the other thing about tolerance, I will tell you, is that it is extremely passive. There's actually no activity required to prove that you're tolerant, with the exception of, on occasion, putting a zipper on your lips and not saying something smug about somebody when you know they really deserve it, right? So that's kind of, and which is why the vast majority of people in every organization, if asked, are you tolerant? They would say, well, yes, I am, and more tolerant than most of the other people around here. And the reason is because there's nothing that you have to do to prove it. It's more of a state of mind, okay? But here's the thing. Being tolerant, although we say it's a low standard, the brain actually really likes just being tolerant around other people. How come? It's easy. Remember the Staples commercial with the easy button? It's the easy thing because the brain loves to take shortcuts. And the reason, and we'll talk about some of those shortcuts a little bit later, but the reason tolerance is so appealing to me or you, especially when I've got a bunch of other things to do today, is because the human brain is the most energy inefficient part of our body. The human brain only takes up about 3% of our body mass for most people, 3 to 4%. But do you know that even on our slow days, it requires at least 20% of all caloric energy that we've consumed converted into glucose to keep this thing working, just so I can walk and chew gum at the same time. And on my busy days, when I maybe have bounced from meeting to meeting to meeting, it can take up to 40% of all available calories converted into glucose just from my brain function without shutting down. Which leads me to wonder, do you think you could ever lose weight by just thinking hard? Maybe not so much. But anyways, so my microphone fell. So at any rate, what we find is that as appealing as tolerance is, it's not very practical in a large, diverse organization such as Procter & Gamble. And the reason is every time we have to work with somebody who is different than we are, and different can mean anything. It can mean age, gender, education level, personality type, whatever it is, my brain has to work to basically translate the way I see things into the way I hope you see things. So in an increasingly diverse organization, which we have now to the most extreme that we've ever had in our lifetimes. We have 5 generations working in the workplace right now. So even just age-wise, we're incredibly diverse. My brain has to work. But once we start talking about how we interact with people who are different than we are, we can go in one of 2 directions. We can go to the left or to the right on this continuum. And we're going to talk about movement towards the left first because it is, in fact, the easiest and is the most genetically consistent way that we move. When our prehistoric ancestors came upon another person, an outsider, or a group of outsiders, what do you think their first instinct was? Think about this. In a land of limited resources, how would we normally perceive outsiders? As potential threats. So we are actually wired to be suspicious about people who are different. You don't have to practice this. This comes online as part of our fight or flight circuit. And it served us well for literally hundreds of thousands of years because it kept us from getting too close to potential harm without fully understanding it first. But what's important to know is that when I'm suspicious of people who are different than I am, it actually leads to some very specific and sometimes not very helpful behaviors. So let's assume that I don't necessarily feel frightened, but I'm unsure of somebody. So what is my natural instinct when I see them approaching? It might be simply to kind of avoid them or give them a little bit of space, right? Because we're not really sure what they're about yet. And let's think about this creatively now. How many of you have actually gone out of your way to avoid people before? Does avoiding people take energy? Does it take creativity some days? Like, how can I not be in the same space as that person? Has anybody ever gotten to the parking lot at the same time that person did, and you were like, I am not walking in with them? So what do? You get your iPhone out and you pretend like you're texting somebody and let them get a good head start. Has anybody ever seen someone coming down a corridor before they saw you and you're like, you know who these people are, right? Now, that takes energy. Does it take energy if you're the person being avoided and you know it? Mm-hmm. In fact, that's a form of, especially if I feel like I'm being left out and I should be included, that's actually a form of social pain which is processed in the exact same circuitry that physical pain is. And that takes energy to moderate and deal with as well. So that's a little bit of energy. Now, let's say we went even further to the left. Let's just say that we've come to the conclusion that our ends are not compatible with one another. And we actually get to what we call a phase of hostility. How many of you have ever witnessed hostility in the workplace? But now, adults can't behave like kids. We can't call names and spit and hit and... They should. You're right. You're right. Which is why we have detention for some people. They shouldn't. But does this mean that adults aren't hostile? No, we're just hostile differently. So how are adults hostile with each other? What are some of the ways they can be hostile with one another? Passive aggressive, sure. What else? Bullies. Being bullies, intimidating people, threatening them, kind of badgering them. What else? Gossip and rumors, absolutely. Intentionally undermining somebody else's productivity somehow, sabotaging them. It could be, in some organizations more so than others, the culture is to use a lot of foul language and swear at people. In one case, there was a general manager who wasn't opposed to throwing things. And he would throw them just far enough that it wouldn't hit them, but it would always hit a wall or something near them. And one of the things I want to do is define this concept of hostility very broadly. Hostility is any activity that we engage in that harms or threatens another person in any way, physically, mentally, emotionally, reputationally, or even from a productivity standpoint, damaging their ability to do their best work. That's hostility. And the energy that takes is matched only by the energy the other person, the victim of hostility or the target of hostility, has to marshal to defend themselves against that. Now, remember we were talking about all those calories that we eat getting converted to glucose for our brains? I want to put this in a different metaphor for you. Imagine the coldest winter day from this past winter, and someone has gone into your house or your apartment, and they've opened all the windows in the upper level. And it's 20 degrees outside, 10 degrees outside. What immediately happens? Temperature goes down, right? And what does your furnace do? Does it turn off? It goes on to the highest level possible, and all that natural gas or electricity that's being consumed to create heat, what happens to it? It goes right out the window. What you have is irretrievable heat loss. And that is something I would like you to think about. Whenever we have even mini cultures or mini climates or mini environments where we have avoidance and hostility present, I'd like you to think of that as irretrievable heat loss that goes away, that will never get back from Procter & Gamble and from the individuals involved. And we do not, importantly, we do not have an unlimited supply of energy every day. So when that's gone, when that's been misallocated, it's gone. We'll never get it back. But this is all predicated on this notion that we tend to be defensive around people who are different than we are. Now, why is that? So a question, why is it so instinctual for us to be suspicious of people who are different? I mean, logically, we know that we shouldn't be, but why do we go there anyways? We don't understand them. You're absolutely right. And you know why we don't understand them? It's because we process information about each other so quickly that there's no possible way, without slowing the process down, then that we can't understand them. This is you or me on the left-hand side, and this is everybody else that we come in contact with. Let's say that I see Richard, or I see Marta. Do you know how long it takes my brain to make an initial assessment of the physical qualities that you have, gender, age, height, skin tone? How long do you think it takes me to make a mental note of those things? About 7/1000ths of a second. It's that quickly. We are programmed to do this. So we'll call that our perceptions. How I'm dressed, how you're dressed, what our posture is like. All these things we make note of very quickly. But then what happens is this. Our brains very quickly go into a processing mode to assign meaning to those things that we observe. And in less than another 0.4 of a second, we have already landed on a behavior and a response by outcome or output. So in less than half of a second, we have sized each other up and we're already in motion without ever going a step further. And that's one of the reasons why we end up treating people poorly sometimes, is because we're acting on very, very limited information. So let's understand what goes on in this association and evaluation process. You see, how many of you are familiar with Malcolm Gladwell and some of his books? Blink, and there's a term he uses called thin slicing. Anybody remember thin slicing? And it's about how we take just little mini chunks of information and we try to kludge those together with our own little algorithm into some kind of truth. Well, that's what we do with each other. And though the information is limited, it kind of goes through this series of coffee filters in our head. When I'm meeting somebody, I'm seeing somebody I already know possibly, the very first thing I'm thinking is, okay, I'm not thinking about the fact that I have a very limited information. I skip that. I go to my needs and wants. How does being around you affect what I need and want right now? Are you going to help me, or are you going to get in my way? That's being taken into consideration. My attitudes, values, and core beliefs about you or people like you, whatever groups I've assigned to you. And then there's my self-esteem and my self-image. How do I feel about me when I'm around you? Do people like you tend to make me feel good about myself, or do I feel insecure about myself? Whether you have anything to do with it or not, just simply my processing. Then there's my personal experiences. Then there is my biases, which we'll talk about a little bit later, my preferences for this group or that group, even down to the level of genetics. Some of our instinctual responses to differences in other people, you don't even have to learn. Just like a rabbit does not have to be afraid of the fox. It just learns that instinctually. We now know that there are certain things in our warning system that are just there because they've been passed down through our gene pool. And so I guess I'm kind of surprised that we don't treat people with disrespect more frequently, because all this is designed to keep us safe, right? Now, so even though the information has been dramatically filtered, we're going to take all this information and we're going to put it into two buckets of information that we have about ourselves and other people. There's our knowledge about others, and then there's our beliefs. What's the difference between those two? Knowledge versus beliefs. What do you think?
One's based in an abstract
Okay.
creation that we form, and then knowledge is based on concrete memories or actual experiences.
Which, by the way, are not very concrete at all. Our memories are extremely malleable, as research would suggest. But even at a moment in time, let's say knowledge is what's mutually verifiable information about a person. Let's take someone like Shelley. We can say that Shelley is approximately 29 years old. She is 5'4",
1.5.
5'1.5", okay. With heels 5'4", as I said. And she's got this beautiful kind of aquamarine necklace on this afternoon. So those are things that are verifiable by everybody in here. Now, the belief part is the story that I tell myself about those variables. As a general rule, how well do you think most of us do at separating our knowledge about our peers from our beliefs about our peers? Perception is reality. Do we even try? Do we even try to separate those two? Heavens no, it's so much work. Why would we do that? And to rationalize why we don't, we have this nifty little trick that we play with ourselves. You see, other people have knowledge and beliefs. Me, I have truth. We take everything that I know and believe, we'll just put them in the same basket and it becomes truth. And so we don't, as a general rule, we don't catch ourselves when we're acting upon beliefs about people versus our knowledge about people, because we really do think that we are the infinite holders of wisdom. Just ask us, right? So let's talk about the kinds of beliefs that are most likely to lead to potential disrespect. The first one is stereotypes, and you've all heard of stereotypes. Stereotypes are simply standardized mental models or qualities that we assign to a particular group. We know that they're oversimplified and generalized. So, for example, ladies, do you have stereotypes about men? Of course you do. What are they? We're pretty tough. So what are some of the stereotypes that women have about men? Don't like to ask for what? Directions. What else? We're horrible listeners. We're selective. We only listen selectively to what we want to hear, right? We're generally not nearly as clean as our female counterparts. What else don't we do? Anything? Share emotions. Very good. Now, men, do we have stereotypes about women? Mountain Shelley's here? No way. Absolutely we do. We know better than to articulate them, but we do. The thing is, it's like we were talking about last night. Do you want to be right or do you want to be happy? Right? And so what happens is this. Stereotypes, I could say any group. I could say people who were in the band in high school. Could we assign a kind of a group of attributes to people who were in the band in high school? Of course, they wouldn't be very accurate and certainly wouldn't encompass everybody, but we can do that. And the reason that we have stereotypes in the first place is because absent any other firsthand information about a person, that's really all we have to go on, right? Now, the thing about stereotypes is we don't typically assign a lot of emotion to them. If somebody behaves in a way that's not consistent with the stereotype for their group, whatever that is, we don't get all upset about that. It's because it's like we know it's loose anyways. But here's what we do have a stronger connection to. It's something called bias. And a bias is a little bit different because a bias is actually a value judgment. It's basically a tendency to believe that some people, some ideas, etc., are actually better than others. Even when we think them, sometimes we know better than to speak them. Okay? A bias can be developed either from my firsthand experiences with people or groups of people, or it can be inherited and passed down. Can anybody in here ever remember hearing your parents or even your grandparents telling you about those people? Mm-hmm. And so it's a little bit closer to the emotional core because it's part of our lineage, even if we know that on the surface, no, that's not right, Grandpa, you're outdated with that. They're held by all people. This is what's so important. They're held by all people at both the conscious and unconscious level. Some of our biases we know we have preferences for. But most of them are unconscious, meaning that they actually affect our behaviors without even knowing that they're affecting our behaviors. Every single person in this room, including me, has biases. And so part of this message is, having biases doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you a human being. If we didn't have biases, and I'll explain why in a second, we would never make it past 9 o'clock in the day most mornings, because there's simply too much information to take in. Biases typically are oriented around a preference that we have for things that we associate with ourselves. So we are the prime candidate. If you're like me, you're good, and that's a good thing. Or if you represent a group that I aspire to be a part of myself, that's what we typically show favoritism and a preference for. So there are two types of biases that we will typically develop preferences around. One is things that we see instantaneously about a person: their weight, their height, their build, their gender, skin tone, age. Do you know that we have, as a general rule, a bias towards symmetry? Has anybody ever heard that? We have a bias towards people who are shaped symmetrically. Does anybody know why that is? It signals health in a healthy potential partner for breeding with for the next generation. And so we all, even though our version of symmetry may differ from culture to culture, we all tend to like people who are shaped evenly, and we will give them more preference in some areas. Then there's things that we have to learn about a person before we know whether we like them or not. As revealed, their education, what they're educated in, how they're educated, their religion, sexual orientation, all those kinds of things. The worst thing that we could ever do is to walk out of here saying, nope, I don't have biases, because every single one of us does. And the reason we have biases is because, and stereotypes for that matter, is because our brain is extremely limited. Does anybody remember, oops, I showed it too soon. Does anybody remember what the original home computer was? The original home computer. I'll show you now. It was the Commodore 64. Now, do you notice what's following the 64 on this box? Not MB, not GB, K. The original home computer had 64K of working memory. That's it. That's it. How much do you think the human brain actually has in terms of working memory? 1/8 of that, about 8 kilobytes. That's it. which is why we can only do one thing. The whole myth of multitasking, we don't have enough memory, enough brain power to do more than one thing at a time, and sometimes even that's a struggle for us, right? So one of the reasons that we fall back on stereotypes and biases is because they represent shortcuts in thinking. They allow me to take a few desperate points of information, make conclusions about those, and move forward very, very quickly. Because if I had to take everything, your name is, yes? Michael. If I had never met Michael before and I didn't have access to stereotypes and biases, it would take me an hour just to figure out how I should behave around you because I have no reference points for that. So stereotypes and biases actually allow us to get through. Sometimes, however, that can actually include treating Michael or anybody else in ways that are inappropriate or as they perceive to be disrespectful. In all cases, what they lead to is what we call prejudgments. The same root word as prejudice, but a prejudgment is simply when we make decisions or take actions without all of the information that's available. Now, we're going to talk about a little bit later, how do we minimize the impact of stereotypes and prejudices? But the result is that, because what we want to do is we want to start acting on more information with people. By the way, prejudgments can be positive or negative. How could you actually have a positive prejudgment of somebody? How would that situation occur?
You could assume that they're dressed nicely, they're smart.
Exactly. Or they wear glasses and they're smart. Or they also graduated from the Ohio State University and are brilliant. OH! That's right. That's right. But that's not a problem, is it? That's not a problem for that individual if I give them the benefit of the doubt because of that. Or is that a problem? Well, what if there were multiple other people applying for that same position? And while you've lowered the bar for that person, you've inadvertently raised it for other people, right? Plus, how many of you have given someone the benefit of the doubt only to be horribly disappointed when you finally hired them or promoted them? They looked really good. You're like, wait a minute, you were supposed to be better than that. How's that happen? So sometimes not only it can be disrespectful, but it can get us in trouble too. So over time, these become habitual. And this is what takes us down that pathway towards avoidance and hostility, is these tendencies. But my suggestion is that we don't have to go down this path. We don't have to start with suspicion, because we also knew a different way of looking at difference when we were younger. When we saw people who were different when we were younger, instead of avoiding them or being suspicious, what were we? Curious. Exactly. And if I'm curious, it leads me to a whole different set of behaviors. I see someone, I remember the first time I saw somebody who had a tattoo. And what did I want to go and do? Go touch it. What does it feel like? Anything that's different to kids, because that's how we learned as kids. But as we start to get older, we start, well, I know everything already, right? I just know about this and that. Somehow that natural curiosity seems to decline, more so with some people than others. But what if we could reignite that curiosity that we had as kids about people who are different than we were? And we actually learned that it's okay to acknowledge and even point out difference as long as our intention is to better understand that difference. And one of my role models, and a person that I will forever be thankful to, was my dorm director my sophomore year at Ohio State. Now, I know this was going to be very, very impressive to most of you, but I was dorm hall council president my sophomore year. That's right. I know, hard to imagine. And I thought that I was all that in a bag of chips. And so Dale, my dorm director, he was just annoyed with me thoroughly because I just represented everything that he thought was wrong and bad in the world. Dale was particularly significant because he was the first African American that I ever became very, very close friends with. He went on to become one of my groomsmen in my wedding. But he used to get so angry at me, I could see his face contort. And he would just say, because even though he was black and I was white, I was like, hey, can't we all just get along? We're all the same on the inside. Come on, Dale. And he would just shake almost. He was like, Paul Mashenko, you don't know what you don't know. I didn't want to hear that. I was like, that would be work to have to figure that out. I was a sophomore in college. I was having fun. But he was absolutely right. And it was that dissonance between us that it actually triggered some incredible growth. And he would say to me, he said, Paul Mashenko, look at you and look at me. You are white, I am black. If you can't acknowledge that and understand how that makes our trajectory through life different. You cannot respect me. I didn't want to hear that, but he was absolutely right. Had I been able at that point to really be curious, it would have opened up, and eventually I got there, but at an earlier age, I could have said, help me understand that. And that is what we call engagement. When I'm curious, I don't walk away or avoid difference. I engage people to better understand it. And it is that process that leads us to this place called respect.